A woman must always pull the curtains when she goes to sleep, especially if the windows in her house are large. Every move you make can be seen clearly by the person across the street. Casey and her husband just moved into a new home, and all the windows in the house were without curtains. This made Casey feel extremely uncomfortable, but her husband promised to install them the next day. However, that night, Casey sensed something was wrong. It started pouring rain outside in the middle of the night. Casey couldn't fall asleep and found herself staring out the window. She could clearly see a man from the building across, staring at them. What was even stranger was that the curtains in that household were never opened during the day. They were only opened at night. Since the person didn't directly harass her, Casey didn't know what to say or do. But things changed that night. As soon as Casey turned off the lights, she saw the person from the opposite building staring at her again. This time, there was only a thin layer of window screen separating them, as if the person was afraid that Casey would notice him peeping. At this moment, the husband came home from work and said he wanted to take her out for dinner, but when they arrived downstairs, they saw several police cars and ambulances in the neighborhood. She looked frightened when she saw a man sitting next to the ambulance. The next day, the news reported the incident. It turned out that a murder had occurred in the building across the street. It was said to be the work of a local serial killer known as the Sandman, who targeted beautiful women. Casey suspected that it was related to the man he had caught peeking and grew increasingly nervous. Her husband asked if she was feeling unwell, so she told him everything she had seen in the past 2 days. However, her husband believed that others might have just been looking at the street view and it didn't necessarily mean he was the killer. But this couldn't convince Casey, so she looked up the relevant news. It turned out that a woman had survived last year. In the video, the woman described how the killer would use a plastic bag to suffocate the victim from behind. The more Casey listened, the more uneasy she felt. What if the killer really lived in the building across the street? On her way home, she couldn't help but think about what the woman said in the interview, and she constantly felt like someone was following her. She took a few steps and had to look back, but she didn't see anything unusual. In order to calm herself down, she went to the supermarket to do some shopping. However, just at that moment, a man who resembled the one from the building across appeared. Sensing something was wrong, she immediately walked away, but wherever she went, the man followed. Casey glanced at him from the corner of her eye. She couldn't dare to look directly at him. In the chaos, she accidentally broke a jar of pickles. She quickly took refuge in the employee's storage room. To her dismay, the man quietly followed her inside. It was as if he had eyes in the back of his head, knowing that Casey was hiding behind. At that moment, a staff member appeared, and Casey asked if there was a back door. When she returned home, she told her husband about the incident. The man decided to go to the supermarket to check the surveillance footage. Based on Casey's description of the man's attire, they quickly identified the target. Casey said that the man had been staring at her, but her husband didn't see anything unusual in the footage. He even suggested that the man might have been looking at someone else. Faced with her husband's lack of understanding, Casey silently took a photo of the man with her phone, and she made a bold decision. The next day, as soon as her husband left the house, she grabbed the breakfast and sat by the window, staring at the person in the building across. She tried to prove that the man following her was indeed the man from the opposite building, but she sat there until evening without gaining any evidence. Could it be that she was just overthinking? Suddenly, she heard a rapid knocking on the door. Nervously, Casey walked over and cautiously opened the door, only to find an elderly person seeking help. But Casey couldn't understand the local language. Fortunately, a neighbor who had just returned home appeared, and he explained that the elderly person was looking for their lost cat. The neighbor warmly invited Casey to their house for a drink. They instantly clicked as if they were long-lost friends, and they had a great time chatting. The woman told Casey that this area could be a bit dangerous, so she always kept a gun hidden in her drawer. Upon returning home, fueled by the alcohol, Casey mustered the courage to open the curtains. Sure enough, the person was still standing there. In an attempt to confirm if the person was really watching her, she raised her hand and waved. However, there was no reaction from the figure in the building across. Perhaps she had been overthinking it after all. Casey breathed a sigh of relief, but just then, the person in the building across responded, leaving Casey frozen in fear, unable to move. Until her husband returned home, she told him that the man from the building across had just greeted him. The couple immediately called the police, and Casey handed the photo to the officers, stating that the person from the opposite building must be him. The police went to the building across to verify the information. However, the waiting process was agonizing. She kept staring at the building across, hoping for some resolution. Finally, when her husband returned, Casey anxiously asked if it was the person from the supermarket. Her husband believed that even if it was the same person, it didn't necessarily mean anything significant. They all lived in the same neighborhood, and it was normal for people to stand near windows. Moreover, encountering someone at the supermarket was a common occurrence. Could it be that you're just not adjusting well to the unfamiliar environment? Casey didn't argue and locked herself inside the room. However, the next day, she encountered the same man on the street. Driven by curiosity, she embarked on a day-long pursuit, tracking his movements. The trail led her to a gloomy alley, and at the end of it, there was a bar. As it turned out, the man worked as a janitor there, and the neighbor happened to be an employee at the bar. Casey asked the neighbor if she was being too sensitive. If your husband doesn't believe you, then you need to protect yourself, the neighbor advised. Upon returning home, Casey propped a chair against the door lock because that was the only way she could feel even a hint of safety. But as she prepared to sleep, someone suddenly grabbed her from behind. Fortunately, it was just a dream. However, at that moment, intense sounds of fighting erupted from the neighbor's house. Casey rushed to knock on the neighbor's door, alerting the surrounding neighbors. The landlord hurriedly arrived and opened the door, only to discover the elderly person's lost cat. There was no trace of the neighbor. However, Casey didn't give up on finding her neighbor. She called the bar and asked if the neighbor had come to work. The boss informed her that the neighbor had taken a few days off, and they weren't sure about her whereabouts. Then she noticed a tall man continuously knocking on the neighbor's door. The man turned out to be the neighbor's boyfriend, who claimed they had planned to attend a concert together the previous night, but she hadn't shown up yet. Casey asked the man for the neighbor's phone number and made a call. To her surprise, she heard the ringing coming from inside the house. The man assumed his girlfriend didn't want to see him and turned to leave. Casey immediately stopped him and asked him to accompany her to the building across to get some clarity. Soon, they arrived at the man's residence. Casey watched from a distance as the man knocked on the door. However, despite the prolonged knocking, there was no response from inside. At that moment, the man received a phone call and said he was leaving. Casey still didn't give up and asked if he could try again. The man resorted to violent shouting and cursing at the door, but there was still no response from inside, and the man left. Persisting, Casey returned to knock on the door once again, and this time, someone finally answered. However, it was just an elderly man, and Casey had no choice but to leave. Just then, while waiting for the elevator, she coincidentally encountered the man who had been following her returning home. Casey barely had time to catch her breath and quickly pressed the elevator button. Later, the police arrived at her house. As it turned out that the man from the building across had filed a complaint against Casey. He accused her of constantly harassing him, staring at his house through the window every day, and even sending people to threaten his father. The police considered it a misunderstanding, but Casey had no choice but to shake hands with the man as a gesture of goodwill. Afterwards, Casey's husband told her that the real serial killer had been caught. "It's not what you thought," he said. Subsequently, her husband took Casey to a party. Everyone was discussing the news of the apprehended killer, and they mentioned that her husband had witnessed the crime scene earlier that day. They asked Casey if she still suspected the neighbor across the building to be the killer, but everyone thought she was just overthinking things. She was so confused that her husband even made fun of himself in front of others. They had a big argument, with her husband believing that it was all Casey's imagination. Tired of the situation, her husband said those words and left. Casey had no choice but to go back alone. However, when she was halfway through her subway ride, she noticed a man sitting in the neighboring train compartment. Immediately, Casey stood up, intending to get off at the next station, but the subway suddenly stopped, leaving her with no choice but to sit back down and wait for the train to start again. At this moment, the man moved to the opposite seat, and Casey gathered her courage to ask him why he had been following her. The man explained that he didn't intentionally stare at her. He often took care of his seriously ill father and led a lonely life. So, he liked to observe things outside the window, and no one had noticed it before. But that day, Casey greeted him, so he responded. He didn't understand why she considered it harassment. Calling the police to investigate would have been enough, but scaring his father by having the man knock on the door was unnecessary. His words frightened Casey. As soon as the train arrived at the next station, she immediately got off. She rushed home as fast as she could and packed her bags overnight, ready to leave the place. But at that moment, eerie and horrifying singing emanated from the neighbor's apartment. Thinking that the neighbor had returned, Casey ran over to find her. To her surprise, the front door was unlocked. She mustered her courage and walked inside. However, what she witnessed left her completely stunned. When she woke up, She found herself lying in bed, unable to call for help in time. Casey struggled and crawled to the living room, intending to retrieve the gun the neighbor had mentioned from the drawer, but in the end, she fainted. Meanwhile, Casey's husband returned home and noticed that she had partially packed her belongings. He went outside to investigate and coincidentally encountered the man coming out of the neighbor's apartment. He immediately stepped forward to call out to the man, but suddenly, her husband still hadn't understood what was going on when his wife walked out of the room. It turned out that everything Casey had said was the truth, and he was the one who didn't deserve forgiveness.